What up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Ask Paul. My name is Paul Abernathy, your host, as always, and welcome to the podcast, where we answer your questions about the National Electrical Code, and you too can submit your questions. Where? By going to paulabernathy.com, fill out the information, click the submit button. It will come directly to me, and I will choose to either answer your question in an email. If it's very detailed, usually it'll be in an email, or if selected, it can be utilized in a upcoming podcast like today's episode. Now, today's question that was submitted was actually answered in an email because it was an extensive reply and because I wanted to put some links in there to some exclusive content that the submitter could watch that explains his question and my answer in a lot more detail than I can do in a podcast, because sometimes you just need visuals for certain things. So I wanted to be able to do that for him. But I also thought it was worthy enough to do a podcast on so I can give some insights to other people. And maybe they'll get it by my verbal interpretation of what I'm trying to convey. And maybe it'll work. Maybe it won't. We'll see. Also, I should mention that this show is sponsored by Electrical Code Academy Incorporated. That is the company of mine. It's a corporation. I am the CEO, and it's dedicated to teaching people the National Electrical Code. That's its sole purpose. So we do have continuing education classes there. We do have ICC license renewal classes available. We have licensing prep so that you can prepare to take your license. That'd be the Fast Tracks Black program. But you know what? We also have programs for those that are already licensed that want to up their game in the residential, commercial, industrial, grounding and bonding, or maybe even electricity 101. Maybe you want to get deeper into all of the nuances, Ohm's law, Watt's law, Kirchhoff's law, paralleling a series, all these type of circuits. Maybe that's your thing. We have a course for that as well. So if you're a company out there, we are also very specialized in being able to offer a turnkey program for companies that have multiple employees where they can actually get everybody on the same page by studying in our little academy here. And we offer those kind of plans for companies. It's kind of like a bulk thing. And we give reporting. So you get to see what your employees' grades are and everything like that. So it's turnkey. So if you're interested in that, you have a company, typically 10 employees or more, you can get access to it, and we'll set that up for you. Just give us a call or email us if you want more information on that, and we can get you hooked up. All right. So today's question was submitted. And like I said, I've answered this question already in an email with some extensive links and all to some resources, but I figured we'd do it again. So I'm going to read this question, and I will do my best to give a verbal podcast version of an explanation. It says, so I'm trying to study up for my journeyman's test within the next year. One of the things I'm having trouble with is getting the correct ampacity of a conductor. I am being told so many different things, and there is just so much contradiction between my employers. Well, that's not good. I want to understand how to properly size a conductor. My main thing is correction factor. How do I get the ambient temperature? I've been told to look up average ambient temperatures per county in my state, and I have also been told to look at the yearly high. Which is right? If either. Also, I would like to thank you for everything you do, everything you are doing to help the electrical trade. I have learned so much from your podcast and look forward to learning more. One day I would like to be in your shoes doing the teaching. I believe that it is the most important thing in our trade. I appreciate that. Most definitely thank you for the kudos for that. And again, I love teaching, and it is an important part of the trade. Many times we're discounted as those that can't do any more teach, and that's could be the farthest thing from the truth. All that have taught, or those that teach well, usually have done it. So we have gotten our hands dirty. I won't say all educators, but most of us, you can tell by how we explain stuff that we've done it, or we've had our hands dirty with it. Over the last 2 years, I've been blessed to be able to have a podcast video series with Jay and help mentor Jay Grunberg, the Basement King. Does it every day, gets his hands dirty, has guys that work for him. And you can tell in our conversations, I wouldn't know some of the things that we talk about unless I've actually done it, and I have. And so others that educate might not have that kind of background, but we need educators, and we need good educators, and we need people that can validate. So here's some advice I'm going to give you. Ready? Before we even get started, I'm going to give you some advice, because you say you want to be an educator. You can start out early because everybody can be an educator. When you comment on something on social media, or you comment on something, you want to make sure that you give a code reference to everything you comment on. Don't just say that's not right, this is not right, that's not right, this is a violation. I always tell people, put up or shut up. If you can't point out why it's a violation, then it's not a violation. So if you're going to get on the social medias, and that's the big thing today, the TikToks, the Instagrams, the Facebooks and whatnot, and people love to post pictures. They don't always think about it before they post it, right? Because sometimes they post something they're very proud of, and ultimately it's got a lot of violations involved in it. But if you're going to comment, make sure that when you do comment, that you actually give a code reference for it, so that you can help that person understand where you're coming from, and you're not just giving your opinion. Because opinions are like, everybody's got one. But if you can back it up, then back it up. That's my best advice to anybody who wants to educate. And we're all educators to a point. Anytime you make a comment to somebody, unless you're doing it just to be an a-hole, you are actually trying to educate them. So when you do educate them, make sure you supply them with the proper code reference and take the time to look for that. Don't be so quick to tap those buttons. Okay, so that's my advice. Start out early, give code references, and you know what? If somebody disagrees with it, that's fine. Okay, everybody's entitled to their opinion, but don't waver from yours. If you've got an opinion, go on and be ready to back it up. Okay, so let me answer this couple of these things in this question. Now, the reason that I gave this individual an email is because I shared with them a video that I created probably over a year, maybe even 2 years ago, called Derating Demystified. And in that video, I explained adjustments and corrections due to ambient or more than 3 current conductors. I explained all that and explained the limitations of overcurrent protective devices, all of that. And you, the general people listen to this, maybe this podcast on Spreaker, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. You don't have the luxury of having access to that Derating Demystified video, because that is in my private collection that's only available to monthly subscribers. And there are literally hundreds and hundreds of videos in there and hundreds of podcasts in there that aren't available to the general public. For $9.99 a month, you get access to all that, plus you get access to any of our webinars, any of the recorded webinars. You also get access to our exclusive Wednesday night live sessions, just for $9.99 a month. Now, you can also become a fast track student, and you get access to the Wednesday night, okay? And there's a lot of videos that are in the Fast Tracks program where you will really learn the National Electrical Code. That is the best NEC learning platform out there, bar none. Not talking about buying a DVD or a book from somebody. I'm talking about graphics, illustrations, and then to couple that up with having me as your tutor, but also gives you access to the Wednesday night. So if there's something you don't understand, you don't have to sit there in limbo. You can come to the Wednesday night and bring your question. Without a doubt, the best system and the most cost-effective system, period. You're not going to find anything that teaches you the NEC near our price. Okay, you buy your $100 book, you see where that gets you. Okay, by the time you end up taking the exam 3 or 4 times, you're going to learn that our system, structured the way it is, helps you not only learn the NEC, but it helps you retain the NEC. That's a key. All right, so let's answer some parts of his questions real quick. Okay, first thing is he's asking about the ambient temperatures. Where would we get the ambient temperature values in order to be able to do a correction due to ambient temperature? So I guess before we can get there, we have to look at what they're talking about. So we're going to start this journey in table 310.16. Now, 310.16, you're all probably familiar with that. That is an ampacity table. And I will say that that is probably the most important ampacity table in the entire National Electrical Code, right? because this ampacity is insulated conductors in raceways, cables, or earth. In other words, direct burial cables like a USC. These are the ampacities of those conductors right here, okay? Now, if you look at that table, 31016, and I get it, if you're in the 2017 code, you're saying there is no 31016, it's 31015B16, but hey, heads up, once you get into 2020, that changes. It's now 31016 like it used to be many years ago when all of us remember when it was table 31016, and now all we're doing is just going back to the way it probably should have been before we went to 31015B16. Okay, this table, I want you to look at the ampacities in this table. These are the ampacities of a conductor based on this insulation type at this temperature of insulation continuously, forever, under these conditions of use. So that's a new term I'm using with you, right? Because you've heard us talk about the term derating, and that doesn't really exist in the code, but that's what we're really doing. We're derating a conductor's ampacity based on a condition of use. But what you get familiar with is something called adjustments and corrections. So adjustments are when you have more than 3 current carrying conductors, okay? And a correction is when you have an ambient temperature that is other than 30 degrees Celsius or 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, in the 2017 code, you saw those temperatures at the top of the table. They're not at the top of the table in the 2020. They have their own code section now, which makes sense. And so all of those little nuances that were there before about the not more than 3 current carrying conductors, the fact that we're talking about conductors that are rated 0 to 2000 volts, and the temperature of the insulation, of the ambient, 30 degrees Celsius or 86 degrees Fahrenheit, all of those conditions used to be embedded in the table's top title. Now it's actually in the code section. So it makes more sense when it references a section. Of course, we have a table that corresponds to that now, and that is what's table 31016. Now, just as to kind of give you some understanding, if I had a conductor that was THWN, okay, THWN is a thermal insulation. It's a thermal plastic. All right. If you look, it's under the 75 degrees C column. If you look down, you'll see those ampacities. That ampacity at that 75 degree terminal limitation, or that 75 degree rating of that insulation, I should say, it is okay. So at 75 degrees C insulation, at 30 degrees Celsius, 86 degrees Fahrenheit, let's just take a 6 gauge. It's good for 65 amps. So a 6 gauge under 75 degree insulation at 30 degrees Celsius, 86 degrees Fahrenheit can handle 65 amps indefinitely, forever. And it wouldn't be a problem. It wouldn't melt down that insulation. The temperature rise is not going to affect that insulation's rated 75 degrees C. As long as the ambient stayed at 30 degrees Celsius, 86 degrees Fahrenheit, then that 6 gauge is good for 65 amps. So here's where it happens though. What if I change the condition of use and I raise that temperature that conductor is placed in to 115 degrees Fahrenheit, for example? Well, that exceeds the 30 degrees Celsius, 86 degrees Fahrenheit. So the temperature is a lot higher. And again, the higher temperature has a negative effect on the current carrying ability of a conductor, right? Because as a conductor carries current, it generates heat anyway. And the higher that temperature gets, it gets that volatile point of the thermal insulations rating, okay, which is that 75 degrees C rating, then it comes to a point where it will start to break down. So we have to change the ampacity of a conductor so that it does not violate the insulation rating of that conductor. And in this case, THWN, 75 degrees C, right? Okay, so one of the tables you have to be aware of is, since we know, let's take this 6 gauge. I'm going to use this as an example for you and try to paint you the best mental picture I can. So a 6 gauge is good for 65 amps copper. We're talking copper, and we're always going to be talking copper unless I state otherwise. So under this THWN is good for 75 degree insulation. It's good for 65 amps at 30 degrees Celsius, 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Safe to say, okay? And it could be that forever and not break down that insulation. Now, since we're going to place this in a 115 degrees Fahrenheit condition, your next thing you have to do is go to table 31015B1. So you turn one page back and you'll see that table. Now that table is for use with the Ampacity table because you notice at the header, it says ambient temperature correction factors based on 30 degrees C, 86 degrees Fahrenheit. That was the same value that we used in table 31016. So that's why you're going to be in 31015B1, okay? If you happen to be using the Ampacity tables for 310.18, 19, 20, whatever, then you're going to use 310.15B2 down below because they're based on 40 degrees C. But our most used Ampacity table, 31016, is based on 30 degrees C, 86 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're going to be using table 31015B1, and this is for that ambient temperature correction. So this is what you ask in your question. And we haven't explained where we get this value yet. We're just going to use 115 to make sure that I answer your question about ampacity of conductors. And then we'll address where you might get the ambient temperature for your specific location. All right, so I told you that it was THWN. I told you that the 6 gauge was good for 65 amps. But I told you it was in an environment that was 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Because it's not 86 degrees Fahrenheit or 30 degrees Celsius, I now have to do what? I have to make a correction. So I'm going to come over here to 31015B1. And since we're asking 115 degrees Fahrenheit, I'm going to use the Fahrenheit column. And I'm going to go down to where it's 114 through 122 because ours was 115. Then I'm going to go to the left. And a straight edge might be great here if you've got eyes like mine and you got to make sure you stay on the same row. I'm going to go over. Now, why am I going to go under the 75 degrees C column? That's because my insulation was rated 75 degrees C. Remember, it was THWN. Now, if my insulation had been a 90 degree rated, okay, like a THHN, then I would have started from the 90 degree, and that's where I would have pulled my actual modifier from. But when you get to 31015B1, you need to make sure that you know what the insulation type is and what its temperature rating is because you need to stay in that column for this modifier. And in our case, it was a THWN. So if I move over to the left, I'll notice that it's 0.75. That is my modifier. That's what I'm going to be using, okay? That is my correction factor, if you will. All right, so if you want to know at this point, so I have a 6 gauge. I told you that it was good for 65 amps, right? But here's the problem. Now that I placed that conductor in a condition of use that is 115 degrees Fahrenheit, you and I both know that now it is not going to be good for 65 amps. Why? Because the table was based on 30 degrees Celsius, 86 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's not what we have. So I will take that 65 amps that we started out with. I'll do 65 and I'll go times 0.75, and it's now 48.75. So that conductor's new ampacity. Now we used to say, when we used to say allowable ampacity in the code, and if you're in the 2017, you might still see that. That's not really used anymore. We removed the term allowable in the 2020 because it is actually the ampacity. So the ampacity is what it is. And this conductor, which started out good for 65 amps, due to the condition of use in the ambient heat so that we don't violate or breach the temperature rating of that insulation, we have to restrict the amount of current. Current results in heat. So in this case, we dropped it from 65 amps down to 48.75 amps. So that conductor's ampacity at this point is 48.75 amps. Okay. Now, this is not 49 amps to 0.7 and round it up. No, it's 48.75 amps. Now, realistically, that 0.75 is useless, so you would use 48 amps. But that's what you've got. You've got 48 amps or 48.75 to be more exacting of a conductor now as far as amps go. So you would have to be careful in the load you put on it because that is the new ampacity of that conductor. Now let's go the other way. What if I had an appliance and I knew what the load was at the end? And let's say my load was 60 amperes. And I know that load. I know that load. And I'm going to be now installing my conductors in a raceway in an ambient temperature that's 115 degrees. Okay? Well, first thing, we know the load is 60 amps, right? We know the ambient temperature. It's 115 degrees Fahrenheit. We got it. All right. And we're not going to assume more than 3 current carrying conductors in the raceway. We're going to say it's not. So we do have a condition of use though. We have a correction that has to take place for the ambient. Now, I need a conductor that's going to handle the 60 amps after adjustment and correction, right? So what I do is, in this case, I can use division and move my way up, okay? Multiplication, you move down. You remember I took the 65 and multiplied it, end up with 48.75? Well, now I'm gonna do the opposite now. If I know I have 60 amps that I need to handle this load, then I'm going to use division in order to find a conductor that after this condition of use still can handle the 60 amps that I need. So what do? So I take 60 amps and I do that and I divide it by 0.75. Now again, why do we have 0.75? Because it's still a THWN. It's still rated 75 degree insulation. It's still 115 degrees Fahrenheit. So when I come to 31015B1, it's still going to be the modifier of 0.75. That didn't change. Okay, so I take the 60, divide that by 0.75, and that's going to give me 80. So now what I do is I go over to 310.16, and we're going to stay in the 75 degree column because my conductor's insulation was THWN, which is rated 75 degrees. And now I have to find a conductor that's rated for at least 80 amperes. Now, since you noticed that a 6 is rated for 65, but a 4 is rated for 85. Well, 85 is greater than 80, so I'm okay there. I'm going to go with the 85. So I'm going to jump this to a 4 gauge. Okay, based on this condition of use, I have increased my size to a 4 for 85. Now, if you want to verify it, because remember, we needed a conductor that's after this correction that is still good for that 60 amps. That's what we needed, 60 amp conductor to handle our 60 amp load. Okay, so we use multiplication, we can verify this. The difference here is I want to take the actual ampacity of that conductor that I'm choosing. That 4 gauge is good for 85. So I'll take that 85, multiply it by 0.75, and that means it's good for now 63.75 amperes. Check it. Is 63.75 amperes good enough to handle 60 amps of load? Absolutely. Okay, so that's how you do a correction, okay, due to the ambient, right? Pretty straightforward, pretty simple in how we do that, okay? All right, so we're still going to be able to handle our load. Everything's fine. We can handle after the correction takes place. We're still good to go. Now, the next question somebody says, well, okay, Paul, what if I've got that same situation, I've got 60 amps of load, but not only do I have an ambient correction that I need to do, but what if I have 4 current carrying conductors in there? Okay, well, that's another condition of use, and it is going to affect the ampacity. Why? Because you have conductors, more than 3 current carrying conductors. That means that the values in 310.16 are not the same because there's a condition of use taking place. Well, we already had a condition of use based on the ambient, but now we have another condition of use based on the number of current carrying conductors that exceed 3. So where do we go for that? Well, there you're going to go to 310.15C1 in the 2020 edition of the National Electrical Code. Right? And in your 2017 is 310.15B3A. They're exactly the same. It's just been slightly modified for the 2020 edition of the NEC. All right, if you look at table 310.15C1, you're going to see that for the number of current carrying conductors, we say 4, then we have to use an 80% modifier. And of course, 80%, we're going to change this to a decimal. So we start from the right, move 2 decimal places to the left, and that's going to be 0.80. Okay, we want it to be essentially the same as what we have in 310.15B1, which is given us in decimal values. All right, so now, you're probably asking, how would I do this? It's exactly the same way. So let's say we needed that 60 amp conductor at the end of an adjustment and correction. Start the same way. Now remember when we took that and divided it by 0.75? Well, all we're doing is going to do an additional one, and then we're going to add 0.80 to this. So we do 60 divided by 0.75 divided by 0.80 equals 100. So now I have to have a conductor, okay? I have to have a conductor that is rated 100 amps under the 75 degree column because that's what our insulation's rated for. So I'm going to go to 75 degrees C column under table 316. And it looks like I'm going to jump up to a 3 gauge. 3 gauge is good for 100. All right, so in order to be able to handle that 60 amp load in that condition of use with the elevated ambient temperature of 115 and the number of current carrying conductors that exceed 3, that I needed to do this and come up with a conductor size that can handle it after those adjustment and corrections. So let's look at it. So I chose a 3. It's good for 100 amps. Now, how can I validate that it's still going to be good for the 60? Okay, it should work because we used division to work up. Then we selected a conductor. Now we're going to verify by working down. So I'm going to take that 100 amps. That's what that 3 gauge is good for. And I'm going to multiply that by 0.75. Then I'm going to multiply again by 0.80. And that equals 60 amps. So that conductor, 100 amp 3, after the adjustment and correction, is good for 60 amps. Okay. So that's how we do the adjustment and correction, and that determines what the ampacity of your conductor is, okay, when it comes to that. Now, there's a lot more involved in it than this, and that's why I sent you a link to the D-Rating Demystified, and for all you out there who want even more, because you got to remember, we still have branch conductor rules. We still have the feeder rules we have to follow. So for those that are like, well, what do you mean? Well, 210.19, A1, A, and B, which means if you've got continuous load, you're sizing branch or conductors at 125% of the continuous and 100% of the non, and you're comparing that to the conductor size of if you have a condition of use that takes place, then you're going to do exactly what we just did, and then the conductor's got to be able to handle the load just like we did after the adjustment and correction, and whichever resulted in the larger conductor, that's the one you're going to go with. So it can get pretty deep, and I'm assuming that's why your employers get confused, because they don't know how to explain 210.19 A1, A, and B. They don't understand how to do adjustment and corrections. And this is why I sell courses to corporations who get their employees on a program, our training program. That way, nobody wants to struggle. And you don't want to be doing something and wondering why you're doing it. So we have companies that come to us, and we will get all of their electricians on the same page. And we'll have a special private session for them once a week just for their employees. And they can bring their questions. And it's a turnkey package that we offer to companies that have 10 employees or more. And if you have less than 10, then it's easier just to get individual programs for your group. But we do groups of 10 and more. But like I said, you're probably getting this program just by yourself. And again, you're free to come to our Wednesday night sessions. Absolutely. But my D-Rating Demystified video goes into all of these aspects of 210.19, A1A and A1B. It also gets into the nuances as well for feeder sizing in 215.2 A1A and A1B. It gets into all that. It even gets into the service conductor sizing, which all of this is very similar, right? But it ends up talking about the different service sizing in 230.42A. And so we get into the weeds, and you'll learn better when we do that. Now, to answer your question specifically about the correction and where did I get the 115? So the people that are giving you this information is a little right, maybe. And the reason I shared an email with you and gave you access to NOAA, NOAA, or whatever it is, the National Oceanic, whatever. And again, people don't inundate me with emails on this or contacting me. I'm going to give you all of this can be Googled. I'm just letting you know. So when it comes to the ambient temperature on a rooftop, there are temperature values that you can get that represent around the country from ASHRAE. But the quickest way to get it is just go Google Copper Development Association rooftop ambient corrections. And you'll get a guide from them that gives you the ambient temperatures all around the country, or at least close to where you're at, that you can use that will give you some of the ambience and what you need to know for that area. Okay. They'll give you that. They will use that for the rooftop adder application. But also, the best way that I tell people to do it, other than on a rooftop, just doing ambient, is I tell people Usually I use the prior year's 3 hottest months, June, July, and August, and I go online and I go to that NOAA website and I'll put in the actual date range, and it brings me back all the temperatures for those 3 months, 3 hottest months. And I take the highest temperature over that 3-month span, and that's the one that I use when I'm doing my, if I'm going to do an ambient. That's what I pick. Now, you can agree to disagree. The NEC doesn't give you any guidance, so if you're this wise old owl that has a better way, that's fine. Share it in the comments. But reality is, since the NEC doesn't give you that direction, your local jurisdiction may or may not give you some direction. So that's what I use. So in Texas, for example, last year, over those 3 months, the highest day we might have had was 105 degrees. Okay, well, I'm going to use 105 for my ambient. Now, the good news is most people will get away with using the 10-foot 10% rule in 310.14A2 exception, and it doesn't have to take those into account because you have that 10-foot 10% rule. And we cover that as well in my derating demystified video. But the point is, most people don't take those things into account for those short spans. But if you have long runs, long spans of raceways outside, and you do have to deal with this, then you can find the maximum temperature over the hottest 3 months and utilize that as your worst case scenario, and then you're gonna be fine. Okay. Again, depending on where you're at, that's what I would do. But you do you, and you do what you feel is right. If your temperature in your area, now as a jurisdiction, you sometimes will set the baseline. So when I was back in Virginia and we would set a baseline, whether it was in Richmond, Virginia or Alexandria, Virginia, if somebody asked us what temperature to use or we were going to utilize it, we would have a document that would state this is the maximum ambient temperature that we would are okay with, or what we would select for you to use if you're going to do a correction in this area based historically, and we would give you that value. And I can't remember what it is. I remember that I believe our maximum was like 105, okay, Fahrenheit, and that's what we would use. And if you're going to do a location that's going to require the correction, that's what you would use, and you have to figure it in. Okay. Again, if it's a 10-foot 10% rule, then again, that would negate it for that aspect of it. So all of that's covered in my derating demystified video. If you're interested in that, go join the monthly subscription. And there's tons of other videos in there. I promise you'll learn something in there. I promise you there's something in there for everybody. But hopefully that answered your question. I know you want me to give you a specific value, but I gave you some links to the NOAA website that you can look at the average temperatures in any zip code in the country over any selected period of time, if that's what you want to use. Again, that's what you'd use. Now, I know that's different in attics. I know that's different other aspects of it. And people say, well, where do you get that? In the middle of Texas in an attic, it could be 130 degrees. Yes, it could be. Absolutely, it could be. That is something you're going to work out with your AHJ. That's something you're going to have to work out. The National Electrical Code doesn't give you any guidance on that, and I'm not here to give you a point-blank value to use because everywhere is different. You're going to have to establish that. What I can tell you is that the majority of the people that I run into and that I work with, when I ask them, do they make a correction for ambient temperature? And usually they say no. One is they don't know what the temperature is, so they just ignore it, and most inspectors won't call it out. But is it a code violation? Yeah, if the ambient temperature was to a certain level that it changed the ampacity of that conductor, which ultimately now means that potentially the overcurrent device is not actually protecting the conductor. Okay, that can happen. So, but I'm not here to tell you how to do that. I'm just here to tell you that you should be taking these things into consideration. And that's the best I can give you. That's the best insight I can give you of that. So for the person that submitted that question, I did give you a couple links in there to some locations that will help you be able to calculate that out if you are going to apply it. Or if you want to work with your AHJ and they're forcing you to comply it, then here, at least you have something you can show them. And the good news is I used 115 degrees here, Fahrenheit, and it wasn't dramatic. Okay. So again, that's probably extreme, but that is probably what you would get in some attics, no doubt. I'm just saying. So anyway, that's the best I can do for that. Hopefully you got something out of today's podcast, got a little insight. Again, learning adjustment and corrections, learning what those tables are for, learning how to apply them is an important part of being an electrician. And anybody that struggles with that, you're not alone, because that is some of the more complicated aspects, is determining what the ampacity of a conductor is. Good news, us manufacturers that make wire and cable understand this, and the ampacities that are in the code are very conservative, right? So we kind of take those things into consideration, and you're going to be okay. So until next time, folks, stay safe. God bless. And remember, you can submit your questions where? At paulabernathy.com, and I will do my best to give you an answer of some sorts. Till next time, take care.